before I get started, if you see an empty space beside you and don't mind like scooching in a little bit, so we don't have to get a million chairs out the back, that would be kind of great. So people can kind of fall in a little bit.
Sorry.
Okay, so I'm going to just talk, we'll close the lights. Okay, so we talked a little bit about what the school to prison pipeline is, but as we talked about, it's a system. So that means that it didn't happen by accident. Everybody's favorite topic, and it's really important to start there. So we're going to go back here. Okay, so 1600s. Enslaved Africans arrived in the U.S. colonies. So as we know, we were brought here to perform labor. We were stripped of our culture, our language, and our land. We were treated as pieces of property. So slaves were also criminalized, and I put criminalized in red because that is the term that you want to really kind of take into account when we're going through this presentation. So slaves were criminalized if they tried to learn how to read, if they assembled for worship without the presence of a white person, or even if they tried to defend themselves. So what you see what these have in common is that these are basic human rights. Your right to read, your right to worship, just your right to even just be black. And this is where we kind of see the formation of white supremacy. So white supremacy is the idea that white people are superior to all other races and should therefore dominate society. It's a very touchy issue. Nobody likes to talk about this, but we're going to talk about it tonight. So we're going to go forward to 1863, Emancipation Proclamation. So they said, okay, y'all complain about slavery, we're going to make y'all free. But in theory, we know that slaves and black people were not free. So what we see is that we got blacks are still enslaved by way of black codes. So these are just a series of kind of like legislative policies that prohibit African Americans from truly being free. So some examples. Blacks had to sign labor contracts, and if you didn't, you were forced to pay fines, and you could be subjected to other forms of harassment and punishment. So let's be honest, who is hiring a freed slave? If you said nobody, you're probably right. Certain states didn't allow blacks to testify in court, even against cases involving African Americans. Blacks couldn't own property, so why is this an issue? There's no upward mobility. You can't establish yourself, even now that you're technically free. And blacks couldn't purchase firearms, so we see the repetition thing, which you can't defend yourself, you can't learn, you can't upward mobilize. So they're still kind of restricting us. So fast forward again to 1896, Jim Crow era, segregation. So this kind of can overlap oftentimes with black codes. So for this purpose, we're just talking about like Plessy versus Ferguson, just like the formal segregation. They said, you know, y'all can be separate, but technically you can just still be equal even if you're separate. But what I really want to point out about this time period is that some black schools really flourished even despite the separate but equal clause. And in particular, what I want to point out is Caswell County Training School, which is in Yanceyville, North Carolina. On your sheets at the bottom, there's a resource thing, and there's a book called Their Highest Potential, which is a case study on this particular school. So what we find here is that what was enforced in the home was then reinforced by the teachers and administrators, and that's kind of something we see a lot in African American culture. We're taught in the homes oftentimes to respect your elders, to respect your adults. A lot of the teachers and administrators, they did home visits. They went to church with each other. They were really well-rounded in the community, so they knew what the child went through at home and what kind of environment they came from, so they were better able to teach them. And in the PTA meetings, the principal will always emphasize, in order to be able to teach a student, you need to know where they come from. So although some schools weren't adequately funded, students still had a positive learning environment, which is kind of some things we don't always see today. We have a lot of teachers and administrators who are educating students in which they have no connection to outside of the classroom, and this can be a huge issue. And this kind of, we'll tie it in at the end, but just keep that in mind as we go through. Now we're going to fast forward again to 1954, good old integration, Brown versus Board. They were like, okay, all the black people complaining, so we're going to put all y'all together and let y'all integrate. Now, in reality, this would have been a great idea had it been implemented correctly, because when you think about integration, You think everybody's going to have equal access to resources, and everybody's going to be on an even playing field, but we know that's not true. We see a lot of violent integration, although not everywhere. Some schools didn't even integrate until 8 to 10 years later. And some people had to be brought into the school by armed forces and other things of that nature. It could be very violent. So not only were they forced into a culture in which they had no connection to and weren't allowed to interact with prior to integration, they now have to deal with the physical and mental abuse that comes along with integration and are still expected to do good in school. There's a loss of community in a sense. All these black schools, a lot of them were closed down and a lot of people lost their jobs and were just out of work. And we see de facto segregation, so not by law. So a lot of white students and white parents were like, don't really want my kids going to school with black students, so I'm going to put them in a private school or a Christian school to kind of get around this a little bit. So that was kind of a lot. I went through that pretty fast. So we're going to talk about kind of how that relates to the school to prison pipeline in today. So to start, African Americans make up about 13–12%, don't know the exact number, of the U.S. population, but account for over half the prison population. So we see that this relates to a bigger issue called mass incarceration, which that is also on your resource sheet. Michelle Alexander, the new Jim Crow, talks about that. So we see that blacks are often criminalized for demanding access to basic human rights. So as we talked about earlier, just the right to own property, the right to educate, the right to just be black. We are often criminalized for these things. And what I do want to point out too is that majority of the prison population, although it does consist of African Americans, over 90% of them are incarcerated over non-violent offenses. So what does this mean? You're probably incarcerated over a drug offense. And that doesn't even mean that you're using it. It could be a possession. You could just be caught with it. And we see a lot of that today. And this brings about another point about just who is deciding what a criminal act is. Because before the war on drugs, drug offenses wasn't that, I mean, people were probably getting arrested, but it wasn't that huge of a deal until the government decided, hey, we're going to put drugs into black communities, and then we're going to start criminalizing the use of these drugs. So why is this a big issue? Our young black boys and black girls are being criminalized for doing what? Probably just being themselves a lot of the times. And half of the students, as Cara talks about a little bit, are attending public schools. 50% of them are minority students. But we find that only 1 in 5 of the teaching staff are people of color. So as she talked about before, we have a large white European staff educating our black students. And like we said, they probably don't have any connection to them outside of the classroom. So behaviors that they exhibit and things that they might do in the classroom that might seem as a criminal act or seem kind of outlandish might just be a kind of norm thing, and they just don't know how to address it in the right way. So once you're part of the criminal justice system, it's kind of just hard to function in mainstream society because, one, you have this criminalized record now, so it's going to be a little bit harder for you to get a job. And if you're not getting a job, you might, I won't say you will, but it's more likely for you to go back to the circumstances or the places that put you in the prison system in the first place. And of course, there's other things that can happen. You can have your voting rights taken away. You can be denied access to like public social funding, different public funding, and things of that nature. But what I really want everybody to take from this is that this is not to say that the school is necessarily a safe place in comparison to the prison system. We want you all to understand that the school itself almost acts as a prison system for our black students. And that we have a lot of work to do as far as reform and just as far as addressing the system. Because prison, although it's the worst case scenario, the school itself can be a place of a lot of discrimination and just harassment for our youth of color. And it's contributing a lot to this system. So this was a lot. I'm going to ask for just a few questions of clarification if anybody might have questions.
You said being black, and I wonder if you could unpack that a little bit more about just simply being black.
Well, I mean, I don't know if you want to add anything too, but
being black, meaning, so I think the main thing is that here we have rights, that are in our Constitution, that are talked about, excited about, and a right that everyone should have. And for many years, we were denied those rights. So it's Black people are being criminalized for things that white people have done for years. So even today in our daily life, a Black person does it. This connects straight to the the school to prison pipeline, because we have students doing these misdemeanors, but 3 times more likely a Black student will be punished for it and not a white student. So it is a being Black sort of understanding. You're being Black, and that's why you're being punished. You want to help?
Yeah, I think also it's like your hairstyles. I think that's like part of this being Black is also like you can be like punished for your hair, being your hair unruly. You can also be punished for your body type, sort of like dress codes. You can also be punished for not using correct grammar at times. That can also lead to sort of like being punished or being suspended. And I'm not saying like incorrect grammar is Black, but it's when it's like non-normative and non-like European, it can also be, you can also see like a mark or something like that. So I think like that's,
Yeah. Awesome. Someone in the back too.
Yeah, what's also the bias of a Black body, so like you could be in a classroom and you're perceived as yelling, like a Black person is perceived as yelling, being violent when you're just speaking in a normal tone. So we find a lot of like Black women are kicked out of schools because they were yelling or instructing in the classroom when they're actually just talking to someone else in the classroom. But they're seen as being violent, seen as yelling or being hostile towards people, when it's just the way that culture communicates.
Going off that, we kind of want to get away from the idea that there's this whole like respectability thing, like where if you like pull up your pants, you know, you speak proper English, you just behave yourself well, that you'll be like, you won't be exposed to any of these like racist policies or any of these systems, and we know that's not true at all. So just to point that out.
I was just going to say that when you look into Chapel Hill, Carrboro City Schools, the key thing is that it's for the same offense. So I think we have to make that point. So if it's like 2 students, 1 Black, 1 white, and they do exactly the same thing. So in North Carolina, it's actually 4 times more likely this year's latest report. But so it's the same offense for one thing, and then the other thing is that there are in-school suspensions and out-of-school suspensions, and so that's another subtlety around who gets which one.
Right, because if you, like on your fact sheet, like we make up majority of the expulsions, which is a big problem because you're not in school at all. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong with expulsions, that means for the whole county, I believe. So you probably have to relocate as well. So that's
you can't even relocate. Some counties will not take you.
After you get expelled. So that's a huge issue. I mean, we make up like way over half of those numbers.
Was there one more comment over here?
There's also research that says that once a Black boy reaches the eye level of a teacher, things change. The child, for some reason, becomes more intimidated.
And that's bringing up that idea of criminalization again, because I'm sure a lot of people know that Black males are seen as older. Like, I think that's kind of what you're talking about, seen as older. Like, young boys are seen as men oftentimes. Like, so that's just like this idea of criminalizing a Black body. But
So we're going to unpack this even more through like our discussion and through the panel. But we want to go ahead and invite our panelists up to talk a little bit.